guys. Welcome back to another episode of the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. Today, I want to talk about the government and how the continuous, as we all know, they continue to do the opposite of what the American people want, and the repercussions of that is unknown. So, right now, we're going to jump right into it, and I hope you guys enjoy. Across the United States, there are a growing feeling that something doesn't quite add up, that the priorities coming out of Washington don't always reflect the realities people are living every day. We hear about global conflicts, national security, and military strategy, but at the same time, millions of Americans are dealing with rising costs, uncertainty, and systems that feel like they're falling behind. So the real question becomes, what are the repercussions of war? Not just overseas, but right here at home. And is the government still aligned with the people it was built to represent? War is always represented to the American people as a necessity, something unavoidable and something strategic, something done in the name of protection and stability. But the more I look at it, the more that explanation starts to feel incomplete. Because what we've actually are living through isn't just a series of conflicts overseas. It's a long term pattern of decisions that continuously redirect resources and attention and accountability away from the American people themselves. And over time, that pattern starts to raise a deeper question in my mind. Is this really about security? Or has it become something the system prioritizes regardless of what the public actually wants? After the events of September 11, 2001, the shifts in the country was immediate and massive. Entire policies were rewritten and the new agencies were expanded, as well as surveillance increased, and the United States um, entered prolonged conflicts like the war in Afghanistan and the Iraq War that would last for decades. And while those actions were framed as a necessary response to a real threat, what stands out to me now isn't just why those wars started, but how long they continued and how much they consumed and how little the average American had a say as they unfolded. Because when you really break it down, war isn't just something that happens over there. It has direct consequences here at home, even if they're not always obvious at first. Trillions of dollars have been spent across three conflicts, money that reflects decisions and priorities and trade offs. And when I look around at the infrastructure and the education gaps in this country, it's hard not to question how different things might look if a fraction of the resources used for war had been directed inward instead of outward. And that's my frustration. It starts to deepen for me because it's not just about the money, it's about the messages those decisions send. When people are, told there isn't enough funding to fix roads or support families who improve healthcare systems or stabilize economic pressures, but at the same time there's seemingly unlimited funding for the military operations and defense expansions, it creates a contradiction that is impossible to ignore. It starts to feel like the priorities being set at the top don't actually reflect the needs being felt at the ground level. And it's not that it doesn't feel that way. We know that's how it is, and it's backwards, as we all know. And what makes it even more concerning for me is um, how do you say it? How normalized all of it how it just became normal over time. War used to dominate public conversation. It was debated and scrutinized and questioned. Now it often exists in the background. Headlines comes and Headlines come and go, coverage fades, and entire operations continue with minimal sustained attention from the public. And when something that significant becomes a background noise, it creates a kind of passive acceptance where decisions of massive consequences continue without the same level of accountability they once had. And then at the same time, the human cost of these decisions, it doesn't fade, it just because the public's attention does. Veterans return home carrying the weight of experiences that don't simply disappear when they step off the battlefield. Their physical injuries, long term health issues, and psychological challenges like trauma and reintegration into society, and their struggles become part of their everyday reality. And while there is recognition and respect for their service, there's also a noticeable gap between that recognition and the level of the consistent support many of them actually receive once they are back home. The families carry the weight too. The deployments, the uncertainty, loss, and long term adjustments that affect entire households, not just individuals. The communities feel it, and yet those realities often feel disconnected from the broader policy and the conversations happening at higher levels. It's almost like the consequences are compartmentalized, acknowledged, but not fully integrated into how decisions are evaluated moving forward. Sorry, you're going to have to excuse me. I've had this cough for a couple days now. The gap between this is happening and what is understood makes it harder for people to engage in meaningful discussions. It creates the situation, where opinions are formed based on the partial information and where questions and narratives can sometimes be dismissed rather than explored. And over time, that dynamic doesn't just affect how the people view the war, it affects how they view the system as a whole. So when people talk about the government being out of touch, I don't think the feeling comes out of nowhere. I think it comes from a repeated experiences where the priorities being acted on don't seem to line up with the priorities people are expressing. Because when millions of Americans are focused on economic stability, healthcare access, education, and building a sustainable future, and the system continues to invest heavily in prolonged global conflicts, or it just creates a disconnect that becomes harder to explain over time. And I don't think this is about ignoring the complexity of global politics or pretending that national security isn't important. It is. The world is complicated, and the decisions at the level really are simple. But complexity doesn't eliminate the need for alignment. It actually makes it more important because the more complex a system becomes, the easier it is for it to shift or to drift away from the people it is supposed to represent without the immediate realizing it. Now, when I step back and I look at the bigger picture, what stands out to me is that war reveals more than just external conflict. It reveals internal structures. It shows how decisions are made and how priorities are set and how responsive leadership is to the public. And when those priorities consistently feel disconnected from everyday reality, it raises questions that go beyond a single conflict. Ultimately, this isn't just about war, it's about representation. It's about whether the system is still grounded in the needs and concerns of the people, or whether it is operating within its own set of incentives and pressures and long term strategies that don't always reflect what Americans are actually asking for. And that tension doesn't just disappear, it builds over time, shaping how people view trust, accountability, and the role of the government itself. So, for me, the real issue isn't just whether a specific war is justified or not, it's what pattern of war tells us about the system behind it. It tells us where the focus goes, where urgency exists, and where the resources are consistently directed. And when you follow those patterns long enough, you start to see a clear picture, not just for foreign policy, but for how the power operates more broadly. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Because once you start seeing the pattern, it changes how you interpret everything else. It shifts the conversation from certain isolated events to systemic behavior, and it forces a question that's difficult but necessary. Is the system still evolving with the people, or is it moving in a direction that people are only partially aware of? Because at the end of the day, a government isn't just defined by what it says, it's defined by what it consistently does. And if those actions continue to feel disconnected from the realities people are living in, then the conversation isn't just about war anymore. It's about whether the system is still truly aligned with the people it is built to serve. People feel like their government is prioritizing everything except them. The dominant sentiment that builds isn't just anger, it's a mix of frustration, disillusionment, and eventually detachment. At first, it looks like people losing trust, questioning decisions, and feeling like the concerns, cost of living, safety, the opportunities that are being pushed aside from agendas they don't fully understand or benefit from. Over time, that feeling hardens into something deeper, the belief that the system no longer represents them and that their voice doesn't meaningfully influence outcomes. As the sentiment grows, the behavior starts to shift, and people discouraged from from traditional participation, like voting or civic involvement or foreign policy decisions that are made. They feel it doesn't change anything, but while others move in the opposite direction and become more vocal, more organized, and more confrontational, it's demanding change. They want change. The history shows this pattern clearly during the Civil Rights Movement. Many Americans who felt excluded from basic rights organized protests and marches and acts of civil disobedience to force the system to respond. That movement led to major reforms, but it also showed how sustained pressure builds when people feel ignored for too long. If that frustration continues without resolution, it can escalate into more volatile expressions of anger. The Los Angeles riots are often pointed as an example of what happens when community feels there is no accountability or fairness left in our system. What begins as an outrage can quickly turn into widespread unrest. And in more extreme and tragic cases, deep society tension has conceded with political violence, including the assassinations like Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, and sadly and lately, Charlie Kirk. And reflecting periods where divisions and the distrust among the people ran especially high. The broader consequences isn't just isolated events, it's the instability it causes and the relationships between the public and those in power. When enough people feel unheard, they may turn to protests, strikes, and mass movements to regain influence, and in some cases, more disruptive and destructive actions can emerge when the people believe there are no effective channels left. The key pattern across history is this: when the trust erodes and people feel ignored long enough, the pressure builds, and eventually that pressure focuses a response, whether through reform, conflict, or significant shifts in how the system operates. I want to thank you once again for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. I would also appreciate it if you left me some comments on what we've discussed today and where you see this country moving forward as we continue to go through day by day with the war in Iran and just everything going on in the country. Please let me know, and I look forward to seeing it. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.